This last video is a longer one, and it's going to focus on education in the Middle Ages, because we definitely can't call the Middle Ages the Dark Ages, considering we are direct beneficiaries of one of its inventions, and that invention is the university. The university is a medieval creation, so you can thank medieval people for your learning. Indeed, the university was a big shift in learning in the High Middle Ages. Because in the early Middle Ages, learning was very different, and who was educated was also very different. In the early Middle Ages, most schools were monastic schools, so they were in monasteries, or they were palace schools, so the likes of Charlemagne was educating his future workers. But from the late 11th century onwards, the focus started to shift. In Northern Europe, cathedral schools in urban areas popped up, and in Italy, they started to develop municipal schools, that is, schools associated with the town. This was because of the increasingly wealthy urban population in medieval Europe. The other week, as you know, we were talking about the process of urbanization, and here we have a cultural effect of this urbanization. The population of medieval Europe is becoming more urban, they're becoming more middle class, and there is a need to educate the sons for their careers. Now, these sons who wanted careers did not want to be educated so that they could become priests or monks. No, they wanted to have a career as a merchant, or in the government, or as a lawyer, or a doctor, or, and does that sound familiar to you today? This means that around the year 1000, that's our, rough date between the early and high Middle Ages, very few lay people were literate, but by 1300, literacy had become so widespread that anyone who wanted more than a pure labouring job knew how to read. Education grew with papal and royal powers because both the papacy and the kings needed well-educated bureaucrats who knew law and record keeping. So these students who went to these new urban schools were looking to get trained in how to read and write to go into a career rather than for religious reasons. So the university in its creation was, in a way, career focused, in similarity with today. You might also find what they were studying in the university familiar. Oh, this reminds me, before I start talking about what they're studying, the origins of the university actually come in the guilds. Now, we talked about the guilds in an earlier video in this Nearpod, and we learned about guilds when we were doing commerce. The origin of the university is in students as guild members. Last time we encountered guilds, we were talking more about how they were in common pursuit. They were all employers, common pursuit, and they tended to be like maybe all carpenters or all stonemasons or all silversmiths. But this could also apply to students. So in these early universities, students formed their own guilds and they hired professors, who they called masters, to teach them. That means that the early universities were not place-focused, they were people-focused. It was the people who made the university. Indeed, even the word university, which is in our university name today, Southeast Missouri State University, it comes from the word universitas, which is another word to refer to guild. So there you go. You have your origins as guild members. You're that elite. What are they studying? Pretty similar, not too dissimilar to today. Students studied what they considered to be the liberal arts. And then once you'd finished your liberal arts course that you would have done as a bachelor's degree, you could go on to advanced study in the disciplines of medicine, law, and philosophy, or rather, as we know, theology by today's standards. Advanced study was only possible back then in those three disciplines. So if you wanted to go to the equivalent of graduate school, you didn't have as many options. The earliest universities, as I said, were guilds of students and masters, and they had no fixed campuses or buildings. Only the Pope or the Emperor could declare a place a university, And by graduating from a university, this gave the graduates the right to teach anywhere and be recognised. The universities were also distinguished by having at least one of the 4 higher faculties. That is medicine, canon law is church law, civil law, and theology. Theology was the smallest, but it was the most prestigious, to reflect that learning had been influenced so much by the church by this time. Despite the fact that most students were not going into the church, what they studied was still hugely influenced by it. But they started off with the 7 liberal arts. This can be separated into 2 groups. Firstly, the trivium. That was 3 literary topics, that is, Latin grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Then, once you completed your study of the trivium, you would go on to study the quadrivium, and that's a group of 4 subjects in the sciences and mathematics: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Now, you would have started with grammar, and of course that was Latin, that's the language of the elite still. Rhetoric was less important. Grammar was the thing that you would have started off with. Had you gone to a school that wasn't a university, like a monastery school, you might have actually just stopped there. You might have just done one subject within the liberal arts, one subject within the trivium, Latin grammar. Logic was the 3rd, and it was usually studied as dialectic. And that means they were looking at this reconciliation of opposites that in the first video I talked about with reference to Peter Abelard and Thomas Aquinas. Logic required comparison of different sources. Arithmetic was the basis of the quadrivium. Most scientific knowledge in the Middle Ages came from practical experience rather than from school. So a lot of these subjects, which we don't think about as being practical, actually were. Geometry was practical because they needed to know geometry to build the cathedrals and castles. And actually, so was music, because they weren't particularly interested in performing music, but more technical questions like the length of string needed to get a particular note. Astronomy was vitally important because astronomy was so important in calculating church feasts and events. If you think about it, there's a lot of movable feasts. The most famous is Easter, and that changes every year. And it's actually a very complex mathematical equation to work out when Easter is going to fall every year. Not only that, but astronomy had a big role to play in medicine and in diagnosing diseases and treatments. So where were they studying? Well, this map shows the spread of the university. It became really popular. In 1200, Europe only had 4 recognized universities: Paris in France, Bologna in Italy, Oxford in England, and Salerno, also in Italy. Cambridge just about misses out on this cut-off date. It was founded in 1209 by professors fleeing a murder case from Oxford. As you can see from the map, the movement of universities spread slowly in England, but was much faster in Italy, Spain, and France. So there's about 20 universities in existence by roughly 1300, but this had grown to 79 universities by 1500. Let's have a look at some of the most important and famous ones. First up, the University of Salerno. The University of Salerno was located in the south of Italy, and it was renowned across Europe for its medical programs. If you wanted to be a doctor, you aspired to go to the University of Salerno. Salerno had the chief medical school of medieval Europe, and it was well known even by the 10th century, though it only became a university in the 13th. The reason for Salerno's success was in its location. In the south of Italy, and you'll remember how we used to call Italy a hot mess, this actually means that Italy has all of the knowledge from those different cultures mixed together. So students in the medical facility at Salerno learned medical traditions from the West, from Byzantium, and from Islam. In general, medicine at this time period was still a mix of superstition, common sense, and careful observation. Medical books were becoming increasingly popular though, and they did often provide good advice and herbal remedies, some of which might have worked. They had to rely on herbal remedies because they didn't have chemicals like we did today. Some of these were really strange, and this gives the medieval period a bad reputation. For example, the urine of a dog gets rid of warts. Onions cure baldness. And to avoid getting pregnant, a woman must bind her head with a red ribbon during intercourse. So those ones wouldn't have worked. But even if we laugh at those silly ones, they made huge progress here. There's actually a treatment for one of the superbugs, MRSA, that they discovered in one of these medieval textbooks. So they actually are manufacturing this drug treatment for MRSA based on a medieval recipe. They did make huge progress because of all of the different traditions that they combined and took the best bits from. So they combined the work of Galen from Greece, the Islamic scholars, and then they added their own work that focused on botany and anatomy. Yeah, they even cut off bodies back then. So without Salerno, we would not have the foundations for modern medicine. The University of Bologna was located also in Italy, but in the north of Italy, and it was well known as a centre for studying law. In Bologna, they studied the Corpus Juris Civilis, which was the laws codified by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian from many weeks ago, and they also studied Roman law. This was a new type of law to them, going back to what the Byzantines did and what the Romans did. And they started to really move away from the Germanic customary law. You remember the Vergelds and compurgations and the rest. Instead, these lawyers were busy drawing up new laws that were regulated and rational. Bologna was well known for its legal school, but it wasn't the only law school that you could aspire to in medieval Europe. There was a great school of law at Montpellier in France, at Orléans in France, Paris in France, and Oxford in England. Now, students always like hearing my stories about the University of Bologna because the masters, that's what they called their professors, had a very strict life. It was the student guild of Bologna that ruled the roost. If you were a master at Bologna, if you wanted to leave the campus, you had to post bond. And you got fined if you fell behind in your lectures or if the students decided that you failed to cover the course in the right way. The students had a lot of control. Students' faces always light up when I tell them this. And I say, yeah, but it's not even the masters or the professors who control things today. It's all the administrators. The University of Paris is the oldest Northern European university. The masters from the University of Paris taught at different schools scattered around the city, but the most important of these different schools was the Cathedral School of Notre Dame. The leader of the Faculty of Theology was the Dean of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. This meant that it was very well renowned for its theology, and this is the school where Peter Abelard and Thomas Aquinas both taught. Now, not everything was rosy, though. The masters quarrelled with the cathedral dean about admissions and the curriculum. Obviously, the masters wanted it to be more inclusive and free than the dean of the cathedral did. They argued about this for a long time, and eventually the Pope intervened and gave them their rights. So what was life like for these students? Well, they went to school a lot earlier than we would today. And by that I mean an age. Most students might have started around the age of 15. Like today, they studied under different masters, but they had a senior master who oversaw the studies. Students apparently deputised one student to take notes, and then they all went to the bar to memorise them. Does that sound familiar? After 4 or 5 years, the student took exams to make him a bachelor. And then if he wanted to, he spent another 2 years assisting the master to get his master's degree. He was expected to attend and contribute to weekly disputations before being judged ready for his exam for the mastership, and this culminated in an oral disputation. That meant oral examination, not written. They had to argue their way out of their degree. After their exams, they had to give a public lecture or disputation in front of a group of masters, including his own. And after he passed, he became a Master of Arts. And he could either continue towards a doctorate in one of the advanced fields that I mentioned before. He could also teach, or he could become a pretty well-paid clerk. So we haven't come so far. 80 to 90% of students did not take an advanced degree, but instead left with their bachelor degree. That's because another 6 to 8 years were needed for a law degree, and theology was another 12 to 15 years of study with a minimum age requirement of 35. And that brings actually a nice little tangent here about a myth of the Middle Ages that the people died by the time they were 35. And it's important to remember that, yeah, the average life expectancy in the Middle Ages was in the 30s, but that's because of the staggeringly high child mortality rate. Yeah, it's reckoned that probably about half of medieval children did not make it out of childhood, but died then. So once you made it out of childhood and survived all those awful childhood diseases, you probably were doing all right. The biggest killers of men would have been war, and if you were a student, you weren't going into battle all the time, so your chances of having a pretty long life were decent. If you're a woman, the next big obstacle, of course, was going to be childbirth. But if you survived war and childbirth, you'd live on into your 60s. So 35 as a minimum age was really quite reasonable. Ish. Now, part of the problem with this disputation and this oral exam, yeah, they didn't have midterms or quizzes or check-ins. They had to remember in their brains all of the stuff that they had done and then be able to be examined on it orally. Suddenly your midterms and your finals that are cumulative don't look so bad, right? Emphasis was on memory. And this means that there really wasn't that much creativity in medieval university education. A big part of that is because of supplies. I mean, we've learned about how you made books, and their manuscripts, they're on vellum, they have to be handmade, every part of it's handmade. And this meant that books are eye-wateringly expensive back then. You think about how much some of your textbooks cost, and then imagine that everything in your textbook had to be made and drawn by hand by somebody who was also a skilled worker. That gets really expensive. So a lot of them used wax tablets to jot down really important notes, but that's why they went to the bar and delegated a note taker, and then they try and memorize as much as possible. But the upshot of that is less creativity, since the effort was on memorization. Most students were supported by their parents, but by the late 13th century, some town governments were giving stipends if a student agreed to enter their service after finishing their studies. Benefactors helped students by establishing communal housing, and to save time and money, some lecturers lived there and taught there too. And these evolved into the campus centres of the universities. Students of theology and canon law, that's church law, also tended to support themselves by taking vacant church livings. Now, at least the money from the vacant church living was going to help a needy student, but the parishioners didn't get very much in return. The likelihood of a student returning to whatever little country parish this was after they got their doctorate in theology was pretty slim. Medieval students were also notoriously violent. They rioted, and it got to the point where they had to be forbidden from carrying weapons. Part of the problem was that because of the origins of the university in the church, students were treated differently by the law courts. They had like a semi-clerical status. And this meant that even if they stabbed someone to death, they tended to get off really lightly. This meant that there were a lot of tensions back then between town and gown. The townspeople did not like that the students would get drunk, start stabbing each other, and then get away scot-free. So, yeah, not so much like today. Particularly because it was so argument and debate-based, tempers would rile up and stabbings were pretty common, and not even just between the students. There was a famous case at a German university where the masters had to make sure that they weren't carrying weapons because they would stab each other too. Students usually had a few core textbooks, but they were trying to cut costs down and try and remember the most. A really interesting system is that they would borrow a book and then copy it out in their own hands on much cheaper vellum in a rush, and then return the book. And so over time kind of buy by subscription the textbooks that they needed. They were really quite ingenious. But as I said, it's very oral based, their examination, and this focus was the disputation. So the way the disputation would work is that the lecturer would read the relevant passages and then the students would debate the opposing views. The ultimate goal was to make the other students back down, contradict themselves, or reach a compromise. Two forms of disputation, also known as disputatio, were the most common. In the obligatio, a respondent defended a claim against an opponent who sought to force the respondent into contradiction by advancing other statements. The respondent was obligated to accept any statement entailed by the claims which he had initially presented and to reject anything inconsistent with them, otherwise treating all claims on their merits. The other prominent medieval form of disputation was called the quodlibet, literally a disputation about anything. As the name suggests, a quodlibet il disputatio required a master to settle difficult questions from the floor on any topic within his field. Quodlibets were often public confrontations in which a master, accompanied by his advanced students, would face off against other masters and their students. And I like to think of that as kind of being the medieval equivalent of a breakdancing competition, only oral arguments. So on that note, I'll leave you. You now have a little short video to watch which recaps some of the more important things I just said from a different perspective. And then you've got a question to answer in your Nearpod. Words are failing me.